All right. Well, just wanted to thank everyone for joining. Looks like we've got quite a few people that have not only signed up, but even within these pandemic COVID days actually joined the webinar. So super excited for everyone that's here. Thanks for taking the time on Earth Day to talk about a really, really important topic around cloud waste. Super excited for the panel that we have here today. I'm Matt Provo, by the way. I'm the founder and CEO of StormForge. One of the things today will not be about is a deep dive into what we're up to necessarily, other than the fact that we absolutely, as a part of the technology that we're building, are connecting our solutions and kind of the value that we provide to this concept of reducing cloud waste and over provisioning. Outside of that, the topic is going to be kind of moderated and driven by me today, but super excited about the panel of guests that we have with us today. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Just to give a little bit of agenda, we'll spend about 20-25 minutes talking through some questions related to this topic. Each of you can submit questions throughout in the Zoom, and we'll get to some of those across the last 10 or 15 minutes of the panel today. But we will spend the first half or 2/3 talking through some topical questions that we've come up with for this webinar. As I've mentioned, I've got Adrian, Cheryl, and Eric on the panel with us today, and could not have asked for a better group, honestly, to get together and talk about cloud waste, the impact of that, and really what we can do about it. Thanks for attending. As I said, your attendance, on Earth Day, but Earth Day notwithstanding, does benefit an organization that we've partnered with called One Tree Planted. And, because we all need to eat, each of you that have attended will be getting a Grubhub complimentary gift card. We'll follow up with you afterwards and make sure you have access to that. So let's jump in. We'll start by doing a little bit of a popcorn round robin, whatever you want to call it, between the panelists. We'll go in the order that you see on the screen. And I've asked each of them to just spend 2 minutes or so talking about their background and then why this topic in particular is interesting to them to participate in the panel. So Adrian, if you don't mind kicking us off, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Great to see everyone, and thanks for inviting me on the panel. So Adrian Cockcroft, currently work for the sustainability part of Amazon. Most people know me more recently as being at AWS, working on cloud architecture and a lot of different things there. Spent quite a bit of time looking at this topic over the years, and something, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago when I was at Netflix, I think I did a talk on cloud native cost optimization, which is trying to figure out all the basic techniques for optimizing your footprint, which is a lot of getting waste out of it. Nowadays, I think we're looking at that and then thinking about today being Earth Day. How do we relate just general efficiency in the cloud to carbon footprint on top of that? So it's a little bit of an extra twist, and we can talk more about that a bit later.
Awesome. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks again for being here. Cheryl, why don't you go next?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Matt. So yeah, my name is Cheryl Hung, and I'm the VP of Ecosystem at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is the open source nonprofit that hosts Kubernetes, most famously Prometheus, Envoy, and many, many other open source projects around cloud native infrastructure. Cloud native, from the very beginning, one of the biggest incentives behind it was to be able to use your cloud resources more efficiently, for you to be able to pack your workloads tighter. So I talk to a lot of different end user companies. I run the CNCF end user community, which has more than 140 organizations. And it is something that I hear come up time and time again from people about how to optimize their cloud spending. So in addition to this, I'm also an advisor for a startup called Helio, which kind of bills itself as Airbnb for data centers, but also has a mission to reduce the cloud wastage and wasted resources. So I'm particularly interested in today's topic.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for joining. And Eric, last but not least, to do the intro, my friend.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Mulartrick. I am a FinOps lead at Boomi, and I have actually been practicing FinOps for about a couple of years now. My background is more on the infrastructure side, and we had the typical problem when we moved into AWS that it was a lot more expensive than what we thought it was going to be. Why is that? So I took it upon myself to learn FinOps and become the expert here at Boomi. And every day I'm looking for an opportunity to improve our efficiency, and I enjoy it. It is my passion.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for joining. All right, Adrian, we'll start with you. So this concept of cloud waste has sort of been up for discussion, if you will, and kind of forming in its definition. And I know you obviously spent a lot of time thinking about it. Can you just level set for us what cloud waste, at least from your perspective, sort of means from a high level, and then I'll let the others contribute as well.
Sure. So I think the thing that's most different about cloud is that it's elastic. And what we got used to in the data center was buying some resource, and it was going to sit there in the data center for 3 years. You pay the depreciation, and you try to guess how much you'll need, and so you never run out. So you tend to over provision in the data center, and your cost model is kind of you commit up front and then you're depreciating. So when you go to cloud, that whole model changes, and you're paying usually the month after you use something for how much you actually used. So for example, if you need to store a bunch of stuff on disk, let's say, whatever, a terabyte of disk space, you need to buy more than a terabyte of disk space, raw disk space, because of formatting and things like that. And then you need to make sure you never run out. So if you think you're going to store a terabyte, you'll be buying a lot more than a terabyte. But in the cloud, you basically just deploy whatever you actually need at the time. If it ever gets to a terabyte, you pay for the terabyte. So there's this element that it should be elastic. Storage is relatively easy to think about. When you get to compute, you have to remember to turn compute off when you're not using it. So that's a big piece of that. And then the question is, how efficiently can you scale things up and down, and how long does it take? And I think we've moved from like virtual machine instances, which can be created in an order of minutes, and they tend to stick around for hours or forever. But the minimum sort of usage time you typically saw was hours. And originally they were charged by the hour. Nowadays, I think we charge by the minute. Then we came out with containers, which are lighter weight. So and when we first introduced containers, there were some surveys looking at, I think it was Datadog or New Relic, were looking at the lifetime of the containers they were monitoring. And they found that some of these containers were only living for minutes. And that was an interesting sort of viewpoint, that you could create things that are very transient. And then if you look at serverless and the serverless functions, things like AWS Lambda, we're now charging for that by the millisecond. And it's perfectly reasonable to create an instance of compute that's going to run for 20 milliseconds to do something and then go away again. So that is something that, and then you just pay for that piece of it. So that I think is the trend. And then the question is, if you look at an overall application architecture, where do you deploy each of these technologies? What's the right thing for the right thing you're trying to do? And how do you take advantage of the elasticity so that you're never have machines just sitting idle waiting for something to do? And I think that's kind of the most fundamental way of looking at cloud waste. There's obviously other things, but I think that's where I'd start.
Awesome. I love that. Love the characterization there on the transition that we're seeing as well. Eric, I wanted to ask for your comments on that as it relates to FinOps in particular, of course, but in this transition and how we're thinking about what used to be sort of reactive in nature and is moving more to proactive in nature. How do we, even from a FinOps standpoint and connecting that to waste, how do we stay ahead of it?
Sure. So what I like to do is, FinOps is all about, there's three different phases, right? First is the inform phase. So it's kind of breaking down the usage to understand where your costs are going, how you're using it within your organization. Then you move into the optimize phase, which is more or less empowering your organization to understand efficiency and to understand where you can make improvements. And then operate is, a continuous operation of it, right? You may have one day where you're focusing on a new product where you can understand how it's going to be used and coming up with, for example, like what the cost per tenant would be or the cost per some type of unit. And the next day you may be executing on a really massive opportunity that would save your organization $300,000 over the next year. But to tie that back to waste, I found that for me, enabling engineers to see efficiency is kind of the best way to tackle it. And to do that, you can almost think of yourself like sitting in a Toyota Prius, right? You're driving around in your Prius and the Prius is providing near real-time feedback to you that says, oh, hey, if you take your foot off the gas when you're going down a hill, you're going to be more efficient. And it gives that data to you instantly. Now, if you provide that same data to engineers, they also respond the same way. They say, oh, this feature that I released is massively expensive. I didn't expect it to be like this. Let me go, take action to bring it down to the right size or whatnot. So that's at least works for me when I take a look at cloud waste in general from a process perspective.
Makes sense. And Cheryl, what's your perspective on not just kind of the definition and how we should think about what is cloud waste, but what are you seeing in the ecosystem across the CNCF and other organizations that are increasingly, I would say, committed to ensuring that this is a part of their architecture and a part of how they're releasing software and thinking about, what they're building?
Well, I definitely concur with everything that Eric just said and the different phases that he's seeing, because I see the same thing across multiple organizations within the CNCF end user community. Obviously, they're mostly working at the container level rather than using VMs, but the thinking is very much the same. You provide the dashboards and transparency about cost, about how money is being spent, and then you empower individual engineers to do something about it. So you give them tools, you try and automate what you can, but then you give them tools and say, okay, now it's on you to make this judgment about whether you should be building something this way or a different way. So I can't really name names because I don't know if this is a privacy or whatever, but I know some particularly large organizations in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of employees for whom they build up teams specifically within FinOps to deal with this problem. And it's a cross-functional organization. So they work everywhere from executive leadership all the way down to individual engineering efforts. I think that is important to have that broad view over the organization and not just focus on one or the other.
Yeah. Makes total sense and totally understand the privacy stuff. So makes a lot of sense. Eric, I'm curious what your comments would be on how do we take this concept of cloud waste more broadly and apply it, either to ourselves on an individual level or employee level, and like sort of there's this idea around like, does my individual, so what I push for as an individual developer or whomever it is, does that have a broader impact? I'm in a large organization or not. How do I make sure that I understand the impact of cloud waste and what is my kind of contribution to helping remove it?
Sure. I like to encourage, when I work with engineers, I like to encourage cloud waste and have some empathy with, just sitting at your house, right? Typically I'm going to turn off my lights, when I'm going to bed or when I leave for the day, right? So to think about your own resources in that way, right? If I'm going to be leaving for the day, do I need to have, these set of resources on spending the company's money and of course, exhausting carbon, gas, or do I turn it off and minimize, the cost of the company as well as, the carbon footprint? And, what I found is that for the most part, Some engineers have different trains of thought, like there's different motivations. One example would be that I've seen from other folks within the Phenoms Foundation is they'll compare cloud waste to bottles of beer, where a company is literally, or a team is spending 10,000 bottles of beer on nothing, more or less, because they're leaving the resources on nights and weekends. Whereas you could also compare it to a different type of motivation, like, ooh, I really would like to get a Tesla Model 3. Well, oh my goodness, my team is wasting 3 Tesla Model 3s per month. I should probably do something about that. But often you're going to come back to the dollar bill, right? At the end of the day, hey, this is the company's money that I'm spending. And if it becomes an astronomical number, that could be something that is a way that collectively we can all work together to reduce that number as a company goal. Or, you have to look at it and compare it to how much money you're spending. Because if you're going to save 10 cents compared to $1 million, you're probably not going to work on that 10-cent one. You're probably going to focus on some bigger fish, but it all is relative depending on your organization's usage and spend.
Makes sense. Adrian, curious on your comments, in this transition you're talking about to more elasticity and different kinds of services. How do developers think about keeping their applications performing at the level they need to for business reasons or whatever it is, and at the same time continuing to stay kind of connected to this concept of making sure that they're utilizing and consuming the resources that they need without having to sacrifice on performance, right?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to work on, if your intuition is probably wrong. So that's the first thing to start with. People tend to not really understand what is expensive and what isn't expensive. So one of the things that I recommend is, if you look at your cloud bill every month, how much attribution do you have from that bill? Can you take every line item and say this line item is assigned to this team or this developer or this tool or whatever it is? And then it was something that you can either build into your tooling, but a lot of people, they get a long way into it's sort of messy when they're getting into cloud and they don't maintain that attribution. And one customer I was working with had about 30% attribution. So about 30% of their bill, they knew where it went. And then there was a bit of a crunch on costs and they went, okay, how do we save money on this? It's starting to get big enough that we should be tuning it. And the first thing they did was drive that attribution up into the high 90% range, right? So that's the most important thing. Like if you can send every manager in your organization every Monday morning, you get a little thing saying, this is how much your team spent last week. How much of the total Amazon bill we're attributing to you every week? That was one of the practices we set up a decade or so ago when I was at Netflix. And that meant that everyone could say, and it wasn't that we were doing chargeback, we were just making it visible. And then you could notice, oh, there's a 1,000 node Hadoop cluster they're looking around that somebody forgot to turn off that they were playing with or whatever, and it becomes visible. So that one thing is just making that, because then you decide that, spending a week tuning a Lambda function that costs you, that's running in the free tier, doesn't make any sense, right? So you're trying to figure out where is the stuff that scales. Another example, I was chatting to a CIO of a company, and he said that he'd finally realized that he could turn off QA 3/4 of the time. And he was super happy about the savings, but he was really grumpy that no one had told him this 3 years earlier when they got into cloud. He said, I spent 3 years wasting a substantial amount of, we just saved a load of money. And it's like, why wasn't I saving this over the years? So some of this is getting these practices in early, making it so that your QA system is only running, or your development environment basically is running for whatever it needs to be. And even if you're using it all the time, it's 40 hours a week or 50 hours a week, whatever your working week is, there's 168 hours in a week. You don't need it at the weekends. And a lot of environments, particularly in large enterprise environments, the test environment can actually be as expensive or more expensive than the production environment for some of the really critical workloads in banking, for example. The payload of what that workload is doing is hugely valuable. The actual implementation of the machines that run it there's so many test versions of it. There's 3 or 4 different test environments, the same size as the production environment. So you get this kind of inversion. Whereas if you look at something more web scale, you know, the Netflix, Twitter, people like that, what they have in test is much smaller than the full scale production. So you kind of have to get your sense of proportion right. I think that's where I'd start.
Yeah, just to add on that a little bit, Adrian. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you have to figure out if you can turn off environments, as you were saying. And we've been able to turn off essentially all of our development environment, plus we actually turn off our production-like environment on weekends. And that has saved, you know, massive amounts of money just because we spent the time to automate the process, as opposed to having, you know, you go in there, click on the console and shut down your resources and then turn it back on Monday.
Yeah, and it has got easier over time. We now have the ability to basically take instances and just idle them and bring them back later. So, yeah.
Cheryl, how would you sort of define or put into categories the different impacts that cloud wastes are having that you're seeing, you know, across the ecosystem? And, you know, there's obviously environmental, you know, impacts that we're seeing, and there's impacts we're seeing obviously around cost. You know, how would you categorize those sort of thematically around what you're saying?
I think that's actually a pretty reasonable summary. So I think most organizations do immediately think of cost first and foremost before they think of the environmental impact, which, you know, makes sense. Cost is something that's more tangible to a lot of companies. And even though companies quite often do have an environmental department or initiatives, they tend to be a bit separate from this kind of infrastructure work. I do think that what I think it was Eric mentioned about automating a lot of this is really important. So for instance, I see a lot of companies who've moved from using VMs to using containers with Kubernetes and instantly getting a 2 to 3x resource efficiency improvement from that, which is much easier to handle because it's Kubernetes doing the work for you rather than you having to manually look at it and make these decisions yourself on an ongoing basis. So I feel like companies often move towards these kind of newer infrastructures for resource efficiency or for faster release cycles or other reasons, but as a nice side effect, get the reduced cloud spending and the reduced environmental impact.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick comment. If we think about something like ESG initiatives are actually making their way into the boardroom, and executives and, you know, at companies are now, which I think is fantastic, like a part of their you know, compensation and hitting their goals and achieving what they need to achieve, in some cases is connected to you know, reducing or, you know, ESG initiatives within these organizations, which I think is, again, just a fantastic shift that we're seeing. Eric, I'm 100%, curious.
And sorry, I'll make one more comment.
Yeah.
100% agree with that. I think it's a really exciting development, bodes well. And this is also something that I see through the startup that I advise for, which is called Helio. They really did come at it from the thought that there are obviously the huge public clouds like AWS and Azure and Google Cloud and so on, but there's also a lot of data centers sitting around the world that are idling because in previous years and generations, their organizations have over-provisioned and no longer make the best use of that data center capacity that they have. So it can be really good for companies if they can rent out that extra space and kind of, you know, provide their own model to other companies who would be willing to rent space from others.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
Actually, I've been working on some ESG related topics, so I think it's good for people to understand a bit more about this. If you'd like to stay on that for a little bit,
please go. And then after that, Eric, don't let me forget. I need you to answer. How'd you know what to turn off on the weekend? So we'll get back to that in just a second.
Sure.
Okay. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance, and it's not just. I wouldn't say it's going into the boardroom. It's actually more coming out of the boardroom. It's becoming part of the company disclosure that is required by regulations, and it's moving from best practice, which is a lot of large companies are doing these disclosures, to being mandated by certain countries, and particularly in Europe. The European Union has been building up more rules about what companies have to disclose, and there's a proposal to make it more mandatory in the US. So this is something that's sort of top of mind for companies in their quarterly disclosures or annual disclosures of what they are doing. They're supposed to have a report on their environmental impact, what they're doing from a social point of view and government's point of view. You have to report, it includes all kinds of things, you know, not just carbon footprint, but things like, you know, do you have any you know, labor-related issues? What about your supply chain? There's a whole bunch of things in there which are related to this area. And then what we're seeing, though, is financial entities are starting to build funds of ESG-oriented funds. So they're saying, we only want to invest in companies that have a good ESG profile. And so this is putting an incentive on companies to clean up their act and have a good ESG report, and even to report it. So that's kind of acting as a pressure for people to clean up their act. And some of that involves having a good carbon footprint sort of posture. So that's kind of the background. And what's happening is, because this is coming in from the investor community, it's reaching the board who care about this, and it's coming down into the executives. And then, you know, then it's coming down into the CIO and the chief product officer. And it's about your entire product suite. Typically, for most organizations, they spend more time moving atoms and molecules around than electrons. So their electricity bill for cloud operations is usually a small percentage, but they still want to figure out how to optimize for that. The real benefit, I think, of cloud is it helps you transform your product line more quickly to a more sustainable product line. In the same way that we use cloud to speed up digital transformation, we're using cloud to speed up sustainability transformation. And that's actually kind of the new area I'm working on more directly. And I want to just mention one more thing briefly, which is that there's an organization called osclimate.org, which is a Linux Foundation nonprofit. I represent Amazon, that organization into Amazon. And we're working on building a data lake that finance companies can use to try and model the impact of climate change on their ESG asset portfolios, basically. So whole sort of brain dump on ESG there, but hopefully that was useful to people.
Totally relevant, and really appreciate it. Your first comment, which is a correction of me, and I agree, not going into, but coming out of the boardroom, and, you know, and the resulting impacts, both internally with initiatives, but also the external forces around regulations and different initiatives that are driving this, I think is fantastic. So thank you for that. All right, back to Eric. You seem to at least have some level of confidence in some cases of what you could turn off over the weekend, you know, as a way to kind of take this on, at least in some way, shape, or form, alongside the automation you're doing. But curious, you know, just straight curiosity, how'd you know?
It started from actually the beginning. So we took essentially what was in a, you know, sort of a heritage data center environment, and we built it, you know, as code within AWS. And as part of that process, we came up with an orchestrated way to power it down in an orchestrated fashion, and then bring it back up in an orchestrated fashion. So we started from the beginning and made sure that we incorporated it in each and every part of our product line that we release out there. And it's, you know, to this point, it's always been, you know, within our thought process, at least for non-production systems. Production systems, different story, right? That's, you know, we're primarily sitting there, you know, 24/7. And, you know, as Adrian mentioned, you know, being elastic is the way to, you know, get around just having resources sit out there, right? If you can grow with your clients, that is much more efficient than over provisioning and then waiting for your clients to grow into your, you know, workloads that you've provisioned.
Makes sense. Awesome, thanks. Interesting question that came in, actually, and we'll transition just a little bit. I'll kind of ask one more general question, then we'll start taking questions from the audience. But interesting question. How do you get product managers on board to connect, you know, revenue to cost to business value to, you know, how they're sort of leading efforts on what gets built and how it gets built to a certain extent. Like this concept, you know, I love product managers. I came up in product, but interesting question.
I'll take a stab at that one first.
All right, go ahead.
I think what you want to do is come up with some sort of unit economic or unit metric, you know, such as here's my cost per tenant, here's my cost per integration, my cost per golden record, and so on and so forth. And then you can showcase that particular unit economic to say, look, if we're going to add this feature, it's going to add, you know, X amount of users, right? Which is going to offset the, you know, the particular infrastructure. You could set goals for, you know, being flat from a unit economic perspective, or even have some sort of growth. But it comes down to like understanding and putting that business context to infrastructure, and having North Star metrics. At least that's the way I've dealt with product managers in that regard.
Okay. Cheryl, you want to add to that?
Mm-hmm. I have seen in one particular company where at the company level, they noticed that their cloud spending was rising faster than their overall revenue. And they basically made it a top-down company effort to slow this down over the upcoming years to maintain their profitability. And I think having that kind of executive, perhaps mandate is too strong, but, you know, very clear direction that this is part of your job, this is part of what is going to help the overall company in terms of sustainability. That made a big difference to the individual product managers, to the engineers, and to everybody working on the product.
Yeah, makes sense. Adrian, I imagine you've worked alongside and you know, worked with your fair share of product people, heads of product, et cetera, both internally and maybe even externally. Any comments on product management in particular and connecting that to revenue and business value and ultimately cloud waste reduction?
Yeah, in my career, I've actually been head of product at various times as well, and worked on that side. Got a very strange, mixed up resume. So I think that the real thing, so one example I had, and this goes back to about 20 something years ago. I was at eBay in the early 2000s, almost 20 years ago. We used to charge things. We used to charge back to projects for the cost of getting them in production. Like, how many machines do we need to buy to launch this feature? And then we switched it to, this is how many machine weeks we're charging you for running this feature. All right. So we went to activity-based costing kind of model rather than a launch-based costing. It's a very fundamental thing. There were enormous arguments, just enormous internal arguments around it, launching this. But when we did it, the reason we did it was we were out of data center space. We were running in data centers that kept filling up, and we couldn't launch new features because they were full. So we had to create an incentive people to clean up their data centers. And we immediately found all kinds of features that were still running that weren't adding value. People said, okay, yeah, let's just reduce this. We had project proposals to take things offline. We freed up hundreds of machines really quickly. And effectively, I think we lived off of the spare fat in the data center for a year or more after that, before we actually got to an efficient setup. So this was like 2006. But I think that that's kind of the way to think about it. You have to have some kind of chargeback, which lets the product manager have an ROI. Like, what are we spending on this feature? What is the return? And does that make sense? And if something is marginal, then maybe tuning the application and trying to make it much efficient. You can take something from a net loss to a net profit, to a small loss by just tuning if there's a significant amount of cost baked into the business model for it. So it really comes down to having individual little business unit chargeback models.
To add to what Adrian just said, I'm having another example in mind where a company got quite obsessed with the idea of optimizing the hardware in their data centers, with the idea that it would get them a couple of % of better efficiency. And it took quite a while for them to realize that maybe you'll get an extra 10%, but the hardware is very limited in terms of how much extra capacity you can squeeze out of water cooling or packing servers more tightly together. Whereas changing the cloud infrastructure and changing things in software, you can get 10x improvements in efficiency. So a little bit of a warning story.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really where the benefit's going to come in. It's the re-architecture, right? I can only right size so much, but if you really want to take a stab at it, it can be switching from EC2 into containers to start packing the EKS clusters full, or it could be re-architecting the application to really start growing with your clients versus over provisioning.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, Eric, I'm coming back at you, my friend. What is this thing called FinOps that's growing and is getting greater adoption? And how do you connect the world of FinOps to reducing cloud waste and cost?
At the end of the day, FinOps is...
This is an alley-oop for you, my friend. This is like an alley-oop for FinOps.
FinOps is something that, you could basically look at it as shorthand for cloud financial management. So a term that has existed a little bit more, at least in the somewhat near present or near past. But FinOps essentially was birthed out of the cloudability TAC, I believe it was, from J.R. Storman. J.R. Storman is the founder of the Phenoms Foundation. He was one of the founders of cloudability as well. But what he was seeing often was that a lot of customers were asking the same thing. Is there anywhere we can talk to have best practice discussions and work on the same problems that we're seeing within our organizations? And JR birthed it about a couple of years ago, and we've gone from, I remember 2 years ago joining the sessions, we had maybe 30 people in a call. And now the past call that we had a couple of weeks ago, we had over 500, or close to 500, excuse me, which was incredible. But more or less, it's a spot. The Phenoms Foundation is a spot where we can talk about those gnarly problems that everyone is having, as well as establishing a framework for all working on the same problem together. And like I said, it ties back to cloud financial management, right? It's got 3 phases. It's the inform, the optimize, the operate, which all dovetails into what cloud financial management is. But it's establishing these best practices within each organization so we can all think a certain way and change the culture within an organization to start looking for that cloud waste and understand where my costs and usage is going.
I have a question for Eric, actually. FinOps feels to me, I'm very excited by FinOps. Right? Recently, I posted about my top 10 trends and predictions for 2021, and I named FinOps as one of those predictions. FinOps to me feels a little bit like the way DevOps felt maybe 5 years ago, where it was about best practices and the human culture, and the kind of tooling wasn't quite there yet. So are there things that you see as upcoming spaces where there could be more tooling, or what do you see coming next?
Yeah, yes and no. I basically, you can look at tooling in a couple different ways, right? Do I use the vendor native tooling, like AWS Cost Explorer, right? Or do I buy something potentially that will give me, those metrics and data and visualizations that I'm looking for? As you move into containers, there are certainly different, Cloudability, for example, supports containers, but there are, like KubeCost, I think is a piece of software that you can buy that will help you within Kubernetes tell, what or who's using what. But I think that plus some open source utilities, there's also, just to throw it out there, Cloud Custodian, which is something that came out of Capital One, is another way to kind of lay down a level of governance on top of your organization. So, if I have resources that come out that don't, meet my tag requirement, I will go destroy those resources or shut off those resources. But I think at the end of the day, it merges together with DevOps, right? Because you're educating your engineers and your developers about, how they are using in the cloud, and leveraging DevOps tools. Maybe you have it as part of the pipeline where you can see if it's right sized from the beginning per se, right? So, just to it's a mindset that is converging together between DevOps and FinOps in my eyes.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that.
So we are, out of respect for everyone's time, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I've tried to take some of the questions that have come in as well, from the audience. Adrian, I'd love for you to answer Nikki's question live, just real quick, if you don't mind, just reminding the group of the OS initiative that you mentioned. And then if you can be the first to close us out, and just each of you end on, we've talked about what is cloud waste, what is the impact of it, and it's more than fitting to then kind of close out with what can I or what can we as an individual or as a company kind of do about it. So if you can just comment on those things, we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I put a note in the chat session saying it was os-climate.org. That's the organization I was talking about. We're currently working towards an initial release of the open source project. So there's nothing quite there in GitHub yet, but there will be basically a data lake that lets you look at physical and market risk and figure out who owns properties and things like that. So there's a whole lot of stuff there. But on going back to the topic, I think one of the things that people can obviously do is optimize for cost. And it's pretty easy to justify that. You're going to save money next month in the cloud if you can cost optimize. Almost always, that will also reduce your carbon footprint. They are very closely linked. There's a few places where you can do a little bit more of an optimization. And there's a few other things to think about. Some of this is, like in security, there's stuff that's the customer responsibility and some that's the cloud provider responsibility. There's the same thing for carbon footprint, right? There are things you can do and there's things the cloud providers are doing. So right now, Amazon overall is the biggest buyer of green energy in the world, and the biggest in Europe. And we're just buying gigawatt. Earlier this week, we announced 2 gigawatts or 1.9 gigawatts of additional purchases. So we're spending a lot of money to get all of Amazon to be running on completely green energy. And there's a whole, it's more complex than that, but that's kind of one of the things we're doing is like investing on our side to make sure that we're just taking care of these things for you. So that's one piece. If you think about the things that don't completely line up with cost, one of them that you can do is think about all those cron jobs that you run on top of the hour. Think about how many machines across AWS wake up on the hour or at midnight and hit something. They fire off a Lambda function, they do something to S3. They hit our control planes and we have big spikes in traffic on the hour. So one thing you can do is actually called cron jittering. You make it so that your cron jobs don't all run at that peak time. And if you've got, if you're doing a daily roll up, maybe run it in the early afternoon when there's lots of spare solar power and generally the grid is running greener. So the time of day matters. So if you want to ask the question, what's the carbon footprint of my workload? It turns out the answer is extremely complicated. If you just try and measure the power consumption of your laptop when it's running something, it will be all over the place. Like you're running virus scanning at the same time. There's a whole bunch of things happening that are really hard to unpick. But directionally, in almost all cases, just optimize for cost is going to be a double win. And then there's a few extra things you can do on top where you can maybe do a little bit more optimization. But some of those are going to be taken care of by the cloud provider over time. So it's more like thinking about just some incremental things on top.
Awesome. Eric, I'm going to go to you next. But before you give your answer on what we can do about it, I'm going to rapid fire you a couple quick questions that'll be quick answers from the audience. Can you confirm your opinion is Cloud Checker is an example of a FinOps tool?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Cloud Checker is absolutely an example of one.
Awesome. And then the same person would like you to repeat your FinOps sort of something, inform, operate.
Oh, yeah. I'll do it better. Let me share a link to the Phenoms Foundation, and you can take a look at the website. It's free to join. Everyone's welcome. So I will, unless you're a an actual like provider of software. There's an avenue to become a member as well, but it is all on the Phenoms page. Let me drop this into the chat for everybody to see.
Awesome. And then what can individuals or companies do about, to help reduce their cloud waste?
I would start with understanding your cloud. As simple as that sounds, it's more or less coming up with a tagging strategy that meets your cloud footprint. So you can understand where your costs are going. And then once you have that understanding, you can start showing it back, as Adrian mentioned, to your engineering teams and your leadership to understand where you're spending money in the cloud and how you're using it.
Yeah.
And then it's the Prius effect after that, right? Enabling that efficiency or understanding your efficiency.
I think a few people liked your connecting it to Teslas. So that was, people like that. So nice work there. All right, Cheryl, bring us home. What can people or companies do to help reduce their cloud waste?
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on this. One comes from a summit that I attended in Geneva, run by the UN a few years back, about what is the best way that we can reduce the environmental impact of infrastructure as a whole, IT infrastructure. And my best answer at the time was move to public cloud if you are not yet on it, which seems obvious because we've all been working in cloud for a while, but there's still a lot of companies out there who are running their own hardware, and they're never going to have the scale or the ability to do what Adrian described and offset all of the carbon footprint that they're using. So if you're not on cloud, you should move to public cloud, and it will reduce your environmental impact. And then the second part actually is closely related to what Eric mentioned. I really admire the FinOps Foundation and what J.R. Stormont has done for that. I think it's a really fantastic way to find out from other people what they're doing. You're not alone in this. Everybody's trying to figure out the same best practices all at the same time. So go out there, meet the community, and learn from each other and share what you're doing.
And Cheryl, another question for a takeaway. Is it best practice to lift and shift, or is it best practice to re-architect and shift? We can talk about that in another session sometime.
That's a long question, long answer to that.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Cheryl, to Adrian, to Eric for joining. Super fun conversation. We at StormForge, and I'll just close with this so that my marketing team doesn't get mad at me. We have a pretty awesome pledge that as a company that we are committing to remove $100 million of worth of cloud waste in 2021. We'd love for anyone attending here or is interested to sign up for the same pledge. We're a smaller organization, so 100 million to remove 100 million for an organization of our size is a pretty bullish initiative, but we're super excited about it, and we'd love for anyone to who would like to go to the link below here and sign the pledge and we give you details about things that you can do to be a part of erasing cloud waste in your environment. And with that, I just want to say thanks. I know we're a couple minutes over. Most everyone stayed the entire time, so this must have been at least somewhat interesting for people. Appreciate everyone's contributions. Again, to Adrian, Cheryl, and Eric, thanks so much for your input and your contributions. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And that'll wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.